can only imagine when that day comes.
All right, Psalm 89. In the midst of a long prayer, the psalmist is not identified, so we don't know who it was. I tell you who it wasn't. It wasn't David, because the time frame won't fit that. But we know David wrote a good many of the Psalms, and a good many, and caused them largely to be collected, and they did that as long as the gift of inspiration was with them. And thus we've been engaged here for a few months on just working through the prayer life of Israel, learning and things about how, what always strikes me about the Psalms is that you can say some of the stuff the psalmist said because he's just communicating his feelings with his God, and that's okay. God doesn't reprimand him. He doesn't get mad at him. There are things that are distressing him in life. Of course, God understands it on the level that he is. But you ever run into problems that you just can't make any sense out of and wonder why in the world did this, And so that's not a new phenomenon. And God's message is just be faithful, trust me, trust me, trust me. Let's have a word of prayer as we begin. Our Father, we give thanks for the day and for the opportunity that it presents to us. It's a beautiful day. We're thankful for our visitors and our members. And we pray that you bless this study and help us to do our best in your service and to honor your name always. We ask it in the name of Christ. Amen. Let me read verses 30 through 37. We left off talking about that particular passage. The psalm hangs together this way. In verses 1 through 3, he talks about God's loving kindness, acknowledges that, and extols that. And then in verses 5 through 10, he begins to talk about the Lord's absolute ironclad faithfulness. He will do what he says. He always fulfills his promises. In verses 11 through 13, it shifts, and he is praising God for his creative power. And in verses 14 through 18, he talks about the foundation of the throne of the Lord. And in verses 19 through 29, he moves into the fact that God keeps his word. He's a covenant-keeping God. And now we're going to begin to look at the consequences of disobedience. I say it and it just sounds like a broken record, but when you just abandon God, classic example being talked a lot about by a lot of our politicians now, when you're willing to try to advance yourself by promoting the taking of innocent life, it's called abortion, and now you can run out some cases that are what-if emergency cases, not talking about that. Not talking about that at all. We're talking about what is probably 99.5 or more percent of the abortions that are performed. And when God grants every life that's granted, he's part of that. And for me, you or anybody else to end that life without a compelling reason and justification to do that is an egregious insult to the maker of that life. And I don't know how that goes down with you. I can't help how it goes down with you, but the truth's true. God said, for example, he said to the prophet Jeremiah, when you were in your mother's womb, I knew you. He said Paul was chosen before he came into this world to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And on and on and on. So that pre-knowledge, foreknowledge of God is just a given. Well, I stray, but not too much. The point is that when you do these things and you throw that in the Lord's face, that there is going to come a time when the hammer is going to drop. And Israel is about to face that. They faced it repeatedly. God will keep his covenant, but we're going to see that there are always conditions attached to that. In verse 30, if his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my right and my judgments, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments. Then I will punish their transgression with a rod and their iniquity with stripes. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendant shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me, and it shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. Selah. And so God's agreements are always conditional. Human beings tend to forget that quite often. Well, he promised he would do this or that. And it hasn't come through. And did he go back on his word? No. When you went outside the covenant and you didn't keep your end of it, then it's off. And if my sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgment, so there's that's the underlying commitment on our part. His covenant has two if clauses. I read one, and here's the other one. If they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments. You see an example here of parallelism, so common in Hebrew poetry. It's one of the major mechanisms by which they would stress important matters. And so the qualification of the previous verse is restated with a synonymous parallel or a poetic line. And notice that it puts violate in the place of forsake, statutes for law, and commandments for judgments. 4 phrases then are used synonymously for one thing: disobedience. Forsake my law. Do not walk in my judgments. Violate my statutes. Do not keep my commandments. 4 times. Boom, 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 boom. That's emphasis. When a biblical writer, particularly a Hebrew, begins to hit the same thing just in rapid succession, I would say, if I were down in Guatemala, es importante. That's important. He wants you to get that. If he tells you 4 times in succession, my dad didn't say things 4 times in succession. But God's merciful and gracious to us, but he's emphasizing that there's a reason that these negative things have happened because of what you didn't do. In some cases, what you did do in others. Faith in God inherently involves rendering obedience to the requirements of his covenant. You know, if you want your marriage to last, you're going to have to keep the covenant with your spouse, right? I mean, you can't just treat that as if it makes no difference, because your spouse is not going to go along with that. And so if David's sons sin, his point is they're going to incur my wrath. They'll incur my discipline, my correction, and my judgment on those sins. And when man's part in the covenant's not kept, then, of course, that causes great upheaval. Great harm is done. And the Lord will still keep his covenant, but he may have to alter and come at it from another direction. His righteous rejection of sin is such that he exercise it. He cannot be otherwise. That's just in his nature. Disobedience will not only affect the one who is guilty of it, but it'll also affect what God does in the continuation of the covenant and about keeping his promises. The 40 years in the wilderness, they griped, they complained, they whined, and he finally said, okay, all right, here it is. That bunch is not going to inherit the land. And when the spies went, there were how many said, we're well able to take it, we should go up at once? How many? And what was their name? Joshua and Caleb. They were the only 2. The others said, oh man, they're big old giants, and it's nice land, it's got all these wonderful things, but oh man, those guys are scary. We can't do it. We're just like grasshoppers. And the Lord was not going to take such people. and give them that land. For one thing, to take it, it's going to require somebody with a little gumption, and to keep it's going to require somebody with some strength of character. And so, what did he do? They wandered in the wilderness till all of them but Joshua and Caleb and Aaron had passed away, and then he had that new generation to work with. But he still kept the promise. Point I'm making. Verse 32, God's moral justice will always be called forth by rebellion on the part of his people. Then he says, then I will punish their transgression with a rod and their iniquity with stripes. His people are always warned that he will and does demand faithfulness from them, just as his righteousness demands faithfulness within himself. Disobedience can do nothing but bring punishment. He's not going to reward that. Okay, we're living in a society right now where people just make fun of the covenant of marriage, people that are among the elite classes, and they make jokes out of that. They've gotten to the point now that they're not ashamed at all about making fun of or denigrating people of faith just because they're people of faith. And there have always been those people, but they used to be quiet. You wouldn't say it. I served under an elder the first place that I was in Bethel Springs, Tennessee, and he said as a little boy, there was a man and a woman, reportedly, that were not married, that had bought or rented a place. And he said, I was with my dad when we drove up in the wagon, and the other men of the community gathered in there, and they told him, you're not going to stay here and do that. We don't allow that in our community. I mean, you can either get married or you can start loading that wagon, but you better not be here when it gets dark. Now, that was Tennessee. And that's the way they were. Well, I don't think you'd get that response today at all. In fact, they'd probably put somebody in jail for going over there and even suggesting to them that they ought to honor the law of God. Disobedience, Jesus says, the Father says, the Spirit says, can bring nothing but punishment. Rod and stripes suggest the severity of the punishment that sin requires. A parent punishes or disciplines a child, and there's a difference between discipline and abuse, and you cannot cross that line, but they punish or discipline the child, and it's appropriate for God to rebuke and chasten his nation. And that's what he's going to do, is doing. Verse 33, God's judgment, though necessary, does not negate his loving kindness or his faithfulness to what he's previously said. But I will not break off my loving kindness for him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. I don't know if your parents employed corporal punishment or not, but mine did. And let me slide on a lot of occasions that I really deserved it. Don't tell anybody. But they let that pass. But then there were some times that my mama, red-haired Irish woman, I would have known better than to push her, step out that back door and come back in with a switch. You ever experienced a keen switch? I don't know. She dead and gone. They can't go. CPS can't go put her in jail now. But I mean, Mama would drive that devil away from you. You didn't rebel. Rebellion was not allowed. And I think I'm a better person as a result of that. I don't think I had too many terrible, horrible hang-ups because my parents tried to teach me and insist that I do what's right. Disobedience is a thing that's going to bring a consequence. Now, that said, God's not going to, the reason I went off on that illustration, if I got a paddling, they always fed me dinner. I didn't lose the opportunity to eat, to participate in the family. Usually there'd be some reproachment, and I can remember Dad saying, I don't take any pleasure in having to correct you in that way, son, but I'm not going to let you grow up and be an outlaw. And where I live, that was a distinct possibility had I not had a real strong man in the house that, was the bull of the woods there. God's judgments, though necessary, do not negate his loving kindness, his faithfulness. He's just going to bring, he's going to have to deal with that problem and get that put down before he fulfills the promise. The loving kindness spoken of is within the confines of his covenant. His grace never has excused people's sins. Even though his grace is ever present and ever active, it's not going to excuse wrongdoing on my part, your part, or anybody else's part. He has standards that he adheres to. I know, got a couple of young ladies here today. There's school teachers. So mom's a school teacher, daddy's a school teacher, and others in the congregation are teachers. And everybody knows that some students will whine around and not want to meet the standard. You're not doing that student a favor by letting them slide on that. For example, you don't want a bunch of mediocre engineers, do you, designing the building you happen to be standing in that's 40 stories tall, right? I want to know that that guy passed calculus. I want to understand that when they gave him a degree over there in A&M, that he knew what a slide rule was as well as the computer, and that he could do those tests, do those measurements, and he could put up a building that would stand there. We're dependent upon that. And so God is always gracious, it's ever present, but he doesn't relinquish or relent on the standard of conduct that he demands. Faithfulness is the basis of his character. And nothing the man does, nothing a man says can change God's inherent qualities. He's who he is. Man's sinfulness does not terminate God's faithfulness regarding his responsibilities for the covenant. However, our sinfulness may make it necessary for the Lord to alter the way that he'll go about fulfilling his divine word. Yes, he was gracious toward David, wasn't he? Because David, when he messed up, he didn't fool around about anything he did. He was a pretty passionate man. If he did right, he did right with all of his heart. If he did wrong, he did it that way. But God kept working with him. Now, the outworking of his sin with Bathsheba is still playing out in human history. And so we want to always just understand that if God requires me to adhere to his standards, he been mean to me? I can stand here all day. No, he's not being mean. It would be cruel not to if you're going to impose judgment based on this set of rules, it would be cruel not to enforce the rules. That's what would be cruel. And so God's holy character prevents him from going back on his word, however. Since his word cannot be broken, any failure in connection with the covenant not going to come from God. He said in verse 34, my covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. And so just who he is prevents him from going back on anything that he said. What man, and isn't that great? Because he spoke and the creation came to be, and it stood fast. Why? Because he didn't go back on his word. And it'll be there till he rolls it up like a garment. But not until then. What man does or doesn't do cannot force God under any circumstances to deny or to repudiate any commitment that he's made to humanity. He is He is the one you can trust. Verse 35, as God entered into his covenants with man, he lays out his eternal attributes as a composite guarantee of his integrity. He says, once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. God will be faithful regardless of what his people do. He's going to bring about his will. He's going to save the righteous from sin through the blood of Jesus, no matter what people do. He will use a remnant if he has to. What's a remnant? A holy minority, right? And if he has to go to a remnant, if need be, he'll do that just to keep his covenant in place. When the people became so wicked that God was weary with dealing with them, what did he tell Moses? Do you remember? Get your wife, get your babies. I'm paraphrasing. Get away from them because I'm going to do away with this bunch and I'll just start over with your family. And Moses said, right? No, that's where a man prevailed upon the Lord. He said, Lord, in essence, let me keep working with them. Don't do that. If you do that, the Egyptians and everybody else is going to say you just took them out in the desert to kill them. Let me keep working with them. And the Lord said, all right, if you're game, I'm game. And thus it was. Now, those Israelites, that generation, could never in five lifetimes, pay Moses back. I don't even know if they, until he wrote that down, knew what he said, what he did, how he prevailed on the Lord. But the point is that God is going to keep his covenant in place. In verse 36, his sovereign choice of David and David's offspring was to be an everlasting covenant that's going to last as long as this created world lasts. His descendants, he says, shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. The sun and the moon just always bear silent witness to God's power, do they not? The fact that it's there, that it does what it does, and we have worked, and I hope he'll let us solve the way, fusion that the sun does, nuclear fusion. I wish we could harness that and control it because, the energy problem would be over with instantaneously, and there'd be no more reason to fight over oil out in the Gulf. No more young men have to go die, to be able to secure the energy supplies that the world has to have. And so, but the sun and the moon continually stand as silent witnesses to God's power and his creative genius, a testimony to the eternal quality of his covenant. Anybody that can speak that to be and maintain it by the word of his power can and will keep his word. The sun, as an ageless feature of the created world, illustrates the perpetual aspect of the covenant. And we now know that there are billions upon billions of suns and billions upon billions of galaxies. And whenever he spoke all that to be, he wasn't tired. He didn't have to start working out with weights or something prior to the time that he did that. He didn't have to consult any handbooks or textbooks or anything like that. When he got ready to do it, he did it. And that's the God that we serve. And the part of his prayer here undoubtedly touches upon the spiritual phase of the covenant that could only be fulfilled through the coming of Jesus and the beginning of his reign over spiritual Israel, which is what? What is spiritual Israel over which Jesus reigns? Don't make me think I wasted 40 years. It's the church. We are. And so, that's it. And beginning on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. That's when Jesus ascended, took the place of power at the right hand of his Father, and has been reigning over the kingdom since that time. Verse 37, his divine agreement was announced. It was announced and faithfully kept in the Old Testament, but in its perpetuity it issued forth as the basis of the New Testament age. The Lord promises, it shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. That it is the throne of David. When he says it shall be established, that is the throne of David. A throne that would have both physical and spiritual dimensions. The moon, as was the sun or is the sun, is used as an illustration of the permanence and the continuing existence of the agreement. I mean, just look up. God going to keep his word? Look up. Look at what's there. And so it marks that. And this part of his prayer undoubtedly touches upon the spiritual phase of the covenant that could only be fulfilled through the coming of Jesus and the establishment of the church. And so his agreement is announced, and we read that. The moon, as was the sun, is used to illustrate the perpetuity, the permanence, continuing existence of the agreement, and the durability of the throne would be as strong and as abiding as the moon, with its unchanging, constant reflection of the sun. And where could one turn? Where would you turn for a more faithful witness than what all is contained in the sky? You want to know how powerful God is? Look up. Look up. And they've got that new telescope to put up. I think that's just way cool, personally. But I mean, we're aware of things that now that we never have even suspected, and they're learning about how God put it all together and how it came to be more and more every day. The writer moves from the physical kingdom with its literal throne into a prophecy of the spiritual kingdom to which David's lineage would contribute through the coming of the Messiah. Because who is the Messiah? Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And whose direct descendant is he? David's. You check his linealogy. Linealogy, that's a new word. His genealogy, and there it is. God did just exactly what he said he would do, so he moves to that. And whether or not the psalmist, when he was writing this, was aware of the implications of what the Holy Spirit was saying through him, we don't know. You remember Jesus said one time, the prophets desire to see or to look into the things that are now taking place. They wondered about this. And so they were revealing things that were going to be fulfilled centuries later. He comes to the word Selah, and it calls upon the reader of the psalm to just pause and think about what's just been said. You know, we would normally, a teacher would say, now think about that. That's what this word means. And the eternal character of God's divine purposes should cause us to stop and to contemplate with wonder and appreciation the ways of God. We ought to celebrate that every day. You know, it's easy, I think, to get somewhat distracted. Not that we shouldn't try to do what's good and try to encourage people to do what's good and participate in the system. If it gives you a voice, then you ought to raise your voice. But at the same time, this world's not my home, the hymn says, and I'm just passing through. And so we don't ever want to lose sight of that. Now we come to verses 38 through 45, and wow. He cast them off, cast off his people. verses 38 to 45. But you have cast off and rejected, you have been full of wrath against your anointed. You have spurned the covenant of your servant. You have profaned his crown in the dust. You have broken down his walls. You have brought his strongholds to ruin. All who pass along the way plunder him. He has become a reproach to his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You have made all of his enemies rejoice. You also turned back the edge of his sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. You have shortened the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. Selah. So it's just a sudden and abrupt change of tone appears as part of this prayer. This is a long extended prayer, as you are well aware. But in verses 38 through 45, almost seem not fit. Almost seem like they're out of place. And so as he comes to his lament, the discouraged psalmist is looking about at the wreckage that's all about him. And he sees a kingdom that reflects its glorious past only in memory, because there's nothing he's seeing that would correspond to the promises that have been made and what they remember about the past. It is in a state of ruin and devastation. And he's thinking this world, his generation, right? It's hard to think beyond that, but that's what he's thinking. And so at this point, he's seeking to harmonize the apparent contradiction of what he sees in his circumstances with what God's promised. And so verse 38, he says that God has been angry with his anointed, that's the current king, and cast him off. But you have cast off and rejected, you have been full of wrath against your anointed. Now, in the sense of the judgment of their sin, God has rejected his people in that sense. He's not broken the covenant forever and ever, but he's dealing with that generation of wicked people. And a lot of times he will personify it in the king himself, but it's the king and the people. And his wrath of discipline has fallen upon them. And even the Lord's anointed, which is the Hebrew word for Messiah, say it, Joe. The Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashiach, as is used of the earthly king here. And so he's been at the center of the chastisement that's been poured out. Why? Well, because he's God's designated leader. He bears more responsibility. You want the crown? It's the series of sermons I preached here not long ago before I went to Guatemala. You pray, make me like Jesus. Really? That's a noble prayer, but what was Jesus like? You see, Jesus sublimated what he may have wanted to the will of God, to the point that they put him on a cross and killed him. When he was experiencing great popularity, God sent him off in another direction. He decided that he would be obedient to the Lord in every circumstance, regardless. And we went through a series of Gethsemane moments that Jesus had. We had to decide, because he faced things just like you do, because he was the man. He was the God-man, but he was a man. And so he faces those things and made those decisions. And so he is God's anointed, and he's been the center of the chastisement here this king has, because he is God's designated representative. He didn't restrain the people. He probably was out in the lead of it. He figuratively, verse 39, pictures an incongruity between what God promised and what's taken place. So he's looking at his generation. It's not over, but he can't get his mind around that. He said, you have spurned the covenant of your servant. You have profaned his crown in the dust. Well, has God spurned the covenant? It might appear that way to an onlooker in his little slot of time, but in reality, God has administered discipline discipline that he promised and to which allusion is made in verses 30 through 33. He tells them up front, if you keep my covenant, these things will accrue to you, these good things. If you don't keep my covenant, then there are going to be some negative consequences of that I will impose upon you. The qualification, see, was that God's going to fight their battles as long as they stay in his will. Then you can count on him. In this case, the people left his protective care, and as a result of that, tragedy inevitably descended upon them and devastated them. God would fulfill his covenant as he had promised, but the sin of the people made it necessary for him to go another route. And the profanation or the profaning of the crown had been allowed, but the glory of the throne would be resurrected in God's time and in God's way. Well, it's now been resurrected, and who's sitting on the throne? Jesus is, right? And where's he sitting on the throne? In heaven. He's in an eternal realm that we hope to see, look forward to seeing, but we can't really even imagine. In verses 40 and 41, the devastating results of disobedience reflected in the nation's distress. And it makes it appear that God has forsaken his people. God has permitted havoc to come, and consequently the writer uses the pronoun you. He says in his prayer, you have broken down his walls, you have brought his strongholds to ruin, verse 40. And the use of his, a reference to the king, symbolizes the whole nation. He in his person symbolizes the whole nation. And when his people's rebellion made it necessary that God lift his hand of grace from them, pain and sorrow have fallen upon the king and upon the people. And the sovereign crown of the king has fallen to the ground, and he's been taken away into captivity, and the city has fallen into utter ruin and devastation. And with the divine shield of protection removed, the city was at the mercy of the enemy's terror and his taunts. And so all who pass along the way, says, plunder him. He has become a reproach to his neighbors. Verse 41. Those nations and those people who have looked with envy and malice and just unadulterated hatred upon God's nation take advantage of the city's fall. You know, that just sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Or it does to me. I know that we don't have the nation covenant like Israel had. But I believe there's a principle that operates in the universe, and that is if you do what's honorable, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is what? A reproach to any people. And so you can see some of the same kinds of things going on because history tends to be cyclical. And if you do the things that they did to get in trouble, particularly when, you talk about most favored nation status. My word, how has God blessed this nation? And then to disrespect him, we had a fellow come here who decided one day, because he had a dream, he said, I think it was sincere, he believed it, but decided that God made a mistake and put him in the wrong body. Now, the gentleman's about 6'3", weighs about 240, I would say, 235, 240. He was retired from Allied Army in his career. And he used to sit out there about where Mona is and had on makeup and a wig, earrings and stuff like that. And so he was, I guess, trans before trans was cool, And the elders met with him, and we tried to work with him. I've always respected the fact that they did that. They didn't tell him, you get out of here. We don't agree with that. Well, we don't agree with it. I think he made a bad choice. Still think that. But he was given every opportunity to see that what he was off involved in. I talking with him one time. I told him, he said, well, he was anatomically male, but he's just in the wrong body. And I told him, I said, when God made the sovereign decision to put you in the body he put you in, he in that same action decided how he wanted you to serve him. That's your assignment. I didn't ask to be put in a male body. And if I'd have been picking, I'd have picked the better looking one, But the thing is, that's my assignment. And for me not to do that, and that's what I told him, I said, for you to just not do that, refuse to do that, is an act of rebellion, my friend. And whether you recognize it, just to act, said, I'm not going to do it. It's a distressing thing. We've seen people get involved in that in high positions of trust, medical centers and nearby. Said they weren't doing those kind of transition surgeries and giving little kids hormones of the other gender and all of that. And they were doing it. What a horrible thing. And it's just like you're just asking for the wrath of God to fall down upon that. I don't know the day, I don't know the hour, but I know he's sovereign. And I know the way he was then is the way he is now. And so it makes absolutely no sense. It's scary. And so here these folks, his chosen people, are there. They've been the envy of the world. People have hated them, and so they've suffered pillage. They've suffered desecration. They became a byword on the tongues of the people of the nations round about. That's where sin and rebellion goes. That's where it goes. In verse 42, when God withdrew his help, it was as if he had given impetus to the city's foes. He said, you have exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You have made all his enemies rejoice. God had fought Israel's battles for her in the past. You remember when the Midianites encircled the city and the angel came down among them? How long did it take him to deal with that problem? The next morning, there was 187,000 dead Midianites. One angel. They didn't even have to go out. There was nothing for them to do. And, of course, you remember the king loaded up the truck and went to Beverly to borrow from the hillbillies. And so he had fought their battles in the past, but for disciplinary reasons, he's lifted his protection. And you go and read about the times in question, and they were just in open rebellion on so many fronts. And so with no opposition, the enemy had raised his right hand in power against Jerusalem and totally defeated it. Some people don't understand why you have to maintain a strong military force. Well, here's the reason. If you don't, then their bad actors are going to come and take what you got. If they don't go to Sunday school. They're about power, and they're willing to do whatever. They're willing to commit whatever atrocity. And so after taking the city, the enemy rejoiced in that. God allowed the tragedy to occur because Israel walked away from and disrespected the covenant. And I keep hitting that because he keeps hitting it. What does that tell us about today and how we ought to conduct ourselves? We have a covenant. Now, you see, we'll have, I don't know how many people we'll have in that foyer before class is over. And some might have health problems and what have you, but not everybody. You say, well, God didn't say you just had to go to all the services. He didn't say that. What he said was, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but to encourage one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. That's what he said. I believe I can understand the import of that question. I believe that when my elders ask me to do something that's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, then I ought to try to do that. If I'm not just physically hindered, I just believe I ought to try to do that. I think that's what the book teaches. The Hebrews writer said, obey them that have the rule over you, for they watch for your souls. What does that mean? Well, it means obey them that have the rule over you, for they watch for your souls. That's what it means. And so it's not a lack of understanding. It's just a lack of will, lack of commitment, lack of dedication. And we see that. You always struggle with it some, but you see it to a large degree today. It's going to have, if it's not checked up and it's not tightened up, it's going to have the inevitable result that it always has. And so when he withdrew his hand from them, all these things happened, terrible things. And he used this awful experience as a rod of discipline or of correction. Verse 43, the soldiers' swords had become dull, and the king's army was weak and defenseless. You also turned back the edge of the sword and have not made him stand in battle. By default, the kingdom was at the disposal of murderous enemies. Do you remember when the first Gulf War was about to take place? Mr. Hussein was cast as being the devil incarnate, and he's just a real woolly booger, and, they're going to just be all this, they're going to just whoop heads and take names and all that junk. It took 3 weeks. Took 3 weeks for the United States Army at that time to just utterly vanquish the fourth largest army in the world. Well-equipped and what have you. Well, it wasn't because those boys were cowards, but that man had abused them and their families and what have you, and they got a chance to surrender. They just laid down their arms and quit. And I don't blame them. They weren't going to die for that guy. And so, if you get off into sin, it pays a dividend. It's not a very pleasant one. And defeat brings dishonor. And defeat brings loss of glory. And verse 44 said, you have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. The king, renowned and respected, has become despised and humiliated. And his glory has fallen into disrepute. His greatness is plummeted into shame. In verse 45, while God promised to extend the king's days, this king's days have now been shortened. You have shortened the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. This shortened days may refer to Jehoiakim, the last king chosen by the people. He was 18 when he ascended to the throne, and his reign lasted just a little over 3 months. 2 Kings 24 and verse 8. And so instead of ruling for many years, he spent much of his life in captivity. 2 Kings 25:29. And the beauty and the splendor of his throne had been turned to shame. And instead of epitomizing prosperity, Jehoiakim pictures the poverty of slavery. None of this captivity came about from God's failure to keep his promises. It occurred because God, in light of Israel's sin, was forced to administer the appropriate discipline. God cannot lie. He had uttered it. He said that's what he would do, and the wreck and demoralization of the nation came as punishment to a rebellious people. We have a lot of people today that are entitled, aren't they? They're just entitled. I get they see themselves as elite for some reason. And so there they are. Well, what the psalmist says at the end of this section is Selah. He calls for a special and thoughtful meditation upon these disturbing facts. If God be willing, we'll take up there next time and get on into Psalm 90. Thank you for being here this morning.